Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this panel where during 1 hour we will not only discuss the future of the transatlantic relations, but where we were also going to try to reimagine them. The transatlantic alliance has been profoundly affected and challenged in the last 5 years by not only the Trump administration, but also notably by the rise of China and also by some hybrid threats. Commentators have even talked about the end of the transatlantic model and have questioned also its usefulness. The panelists that I am going to introduce in a minute will first make a short introductory speech to share their views on the future of the transatlantic model. And then we will move to a discussion of about 20 minutes. And then you will have the chance to ask your questions to the panelists. You will have around 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the time that we will have before the end of this panel. So let me first introduce Gorona Gergic, who is currently at the NATO Defense College as the 2021 Partners Across the Globe Research Fellow. She's a jointly appointed lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations and the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Gorona Gergic is also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Western Australia and a former visiting scholar at the Harvard Center for European Studies. So you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Pierre-Jean. Thank you, Mariam. Great to be in company of Rachel and Jeremy, and thank you for inviting me to what I believe is the first panel of your conference this weekend. So I've been instructed to keep remarks to 5 minutes, and I basically want to just make 2 points in the time that I have around this big topic on reimagining the transatlantic alliance. The first one being that Joe Biden obviously ran on this platform of restoration of America's role in the world. And so far, in the context of transatlantic alliance, we do see that tone is heading in the direction of restoration. We are slowly seeing to see some substantive changes. But in terms of reimagination of the transatlantic alliance in the way that your panel title suggests, I think it's still very much the early days. There is no doubt that what we have been seeing, in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and other, especially Western European capitals, have been the size of collective relief to be dealing with Biden administration, with a team of people who are some really avowed transatlanticists, people who have been in the know, who have served under previous democratic administrations and are thus making the job much easier in terms of reestablishing some of these links that have been severed during Donald Trump's presidency. So it is not a surprise then that we have had, Joe Biden dialing into the EU Council meeting back in March, that we are going to see a major bilateral summit just in a couple of days when Joe Biden comes to Europe for both NATO and G7 summits and so on. But really, what we are seeing in these early days, in 4.5 months that Joe Biden has been in the White House, has been a sign that things are moving along the restoration line, right? Rather than reimagination necessarily, even though the agenda is quite long and quite hefty, and there are a lot of issues that weren't there necessarily when Joe Biden left White House as the vice president that have popped up and that are demanding urgency and attention from the two sides of the Atlantic. Now, on the second point, and this is where I will just borrow from my research agenda as someone who is interested in Eastern Europe, in Central Eastern and Southeastern European affairs, and kind of thinking about this part of the broader transatlantic region, if you wish, is something that might be useful throwing out to the floor and for you to think about in the context of transatlantic relations, because my argument is that there is no such thing as single transatlantic relations. When we talk about transatlantic relations, we either use it as a kind of shorthand for US, Western Europe, or we tend to just say and kind of really paint with broad strokes of the brush to basically say, you know, transatlantic relations under Trump have been under severe strain. It has been horrible, or, you know, like Joe Biden is in and everything is great. So I, again, as a kind of boring academic, I would urge all of you who are interested in transatlantic relations to think about the nuances here. And one big one here is that actually under Donald Trump's tenure in office, not all of the transatlantic relations have been horrible. And if anything, you know, where we've seen traditional allies and partners in Western Europe being at the pointy end of the 45th president's criticism and tweet storms, Eastern European states were largely spared such treatment. And quite the opposite, actually, if you take a look at some of the initiatives that the United States has launched in this part of the world and where it engaged, we have seen a lot of actually deepening and strengthening of the two sides, whether it's around military contributions, readiness to subscribe to US energy diplomacy, trade agenda, and in some cases even embracing the values that were propagated by the Trump administration. So in that sense, I think for Biden, while we see usually the Eastern Europeans being committed transatlanticists, at the same time, there might be also some bumps on the road as well, especially dealing with countries such as Poland or Hungary, or even, you know, these days, Slovenia, that is just about to take over the EU or has taken over the EU presidency, that will potentially be a bit of a stumbling block given how cozy they were with Trump administration. And again, the sort of daylight that's appearing in terms of their subscription to values that Biden team holds near and dear. So I might just close it there, and I look forward to further chatting about some of the specifics on NATO and other big issues, whether it's trade, technology, China, Russia, etc. So that's it for me. I hope I didn't overextend my time.
That's perfect. Thank you very much for this fascinating introductory speech. So I'm now going to present Rasha Rizzo, with an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security. She's working in the Transatlantic Security Program. Her research focuses on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. Prior to joining CNAS, Ms. Rizzo worked at the Atlantic Council's and Security. She began her career. Ms. Rizzo has also co-authored numerous CNAS reports. So you have the floor.
Okay, I think I can go ahead and go. Thanks for that introduction, John. I appreciate it. I think I'll frame my remarks around Biden's upcoming trip to Europe that he's taking at the end of next week. Of course, he'll go for the G7 meeting and the NATO summit and the EU summit, and then have a few bilateral meetings as well. And I think this is a really big opportunity for Biden because he is a committed transatlanticist. He's surrounded by committed transatlanticists, and he is going to go to Europe, I think, with a message that America is back, and will try to reinvigorate the transatlantic alliance through these messages that he'll come to these meetings with. And so I think there's a few things that we can look at going forward that will let us know, I think, Biden plans to do this. And the first is the G7 meeting. Of course, this meeting is with other countries besides just US European allies. But I think there are some important things that are going to be discussed here that will help us come out of the global pandemic, and that will help Biden sort of spread this message of multilateralism and cooperation. I think the important thing is that we come out of the G7 having actually done something and having accomplished things. So we'll see what happens there. But there's going to be conversations about pandemic response. I think it was Boris Johnson last week who said that we have to come up with a plan on vaccine passports and a global recovery effort. So we'll see what happens there. They're going to talk about a Clean Green Initiative, which is an effort to counter China's Belt and Road, and then of course a global minimum tax. So these efforts at multilateralism and cooperation, I think we can see how far we'll actually go with those at the G7 meeting next week. And then of course there's the NATO summit, and it was a very, shall we say, mercurial 4 years with the Trump administration. And whenever you had a Trump official or Trump go to a NATO summit, you were always sort of sitting on the edge of your seat, not knowing exactly what was going to happen. Of course, Germany was at the receiving end of a lot of angry comments, and I think Merkel and Trump obviously had a pretty contentious relationship. And so I think Biden is going to go to the NATO summit unequivocally supporting Article 5 and really recommitting the United States to a place of leadership within the alliance. So I think this summit will give us a real opportunity to reinvigorate that. And it's going to be couched within this broader context of NATO 2030, which is an effort that lays out a really ambitious agenda for NATO to tackle some of the primary challenges of the next 10 years. And so we'll have an opportunity to discuss things like resilience and great power competition, and the broadening of the very definition of security, which will allow us to talk about things like climate change in a NATO context and hybrid threats and cyber. And then talking about the consultative process, I think. It's no secret that as societal changes happen within some NATO countries, it sort of pulls at the seams, and you start seeing sort of cracks and fissures, and alliance cohesion kind of suffers. So I think that now that we have a US president who is pro-Europe and pro-NATO, he'll hopefully be able to come in and be the glue that holds the allies together. And so I think I'll be watching pretty closely over the next week or so on what happens there. In addition, the bilateral meetings the president will have with people like Erdogan and Putin. But I think we'll go to Europe with a pretty strong message, and it will give us a chance to really reinvigorate the alliance. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. I'm now going to present Jeremy Shapiro, who is the Research Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. His areas of focus include US foreign policy and transatlantic relations. Jeremy Shapiro was previously a fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy and the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings, where he edited the Foreign Policies Program blog Order from Chaos. Prior to Brookings, he was a member of the US State Department Policy Planning Staff, where he advised the Secretary of State on US policy in North Africa and the Levant. He was also the Senior Advisor to Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs Philip Gordon, providing strategic guidance on a wide variety of US and European foreign policy issues. Mr. Shapiro, you have the floor.
Thanks, Pierre-Jean. I had no idea that I had done all of that, so it's good to hear about it. And thanks for having me. It's good to have it. It's good to be here, and it's good to be talking to whoever is on the other side of this camera. Look, your introduction sort of reminded me of this thing that an age-old NATO Secretary General once said that, people are always coming to me and saying that the alliance is in disarray. When has it ever been in array? And I think, it sort of highlights, obviously every point that you brought up is important, and there are all sorts of distinctions, all sorts of issues. It does highlight that it's not clear that we're at the biggest impasse that we've ever had in the alliance, or that the alliance doesn't always have to deal with problems like this. And so, I mean, for me, I think all of the issues that we're talking about are important, but I think it's a good moment actually to sort of get to the base of things, to sort of understand if we're going to reimagine it or not, what we have this alliance for, and what we hope that it can achieve on both sides, on the American and on the European side, although accepting Dr. Gergich's point that there are different European opinions for sure. As Rachel was pointing out, Joe Biden is going to go to Europe next week. It's his first overseas trip of a very COVID-constrained presidency. He is going to lavish Europeans with love and attention. He's going to say that at every possible opportunity that America is back, he's going to participate in what is a virtual orgy of European summitry. It's going to be exciting. I mean, there's going to be some for transatlantic people, no one else actually. There's going to be some amazingly warm press conferences, and I think European leaders are going to feel, so much better than they felt in the Trump years, which was like as Rachel was pointing out, sort of every summit was like a NASCAR race. You were just sort of waiting for the car crash, and that was the only reason you ever went. And usually it came. But I think that we're missing something by paying attention to all of that love and good feeling. I understand it. It's a relief after the last 4 years, but if you sort of abstract from the nice speeches that Biden and his administration have been giving and all the attention that they've been lavishing on Europe, and if you go back to the sort of hushed hallways of Washington policymaking, you see a very different picture of what they want, what they expect out of transatlantic relations emerging from the early Biden administration. They have one extraordinary focus in their foreign policy right now. I don't think in my time following this type of stuff, I've ever seen such focus in an administration. And that focus is not Europe. That focus is very, very clearly China. And if you look at like what the White House meetings are, they're about, China and Europe, China and Latin America, China and 5G. China is becoming the issue around which the Biden administration is focusing its foreign policy, and virtually every other foreign policy issue is becoming subordinated to China. Now, of course, if you're having a China-centric foreign policy, allies are important, and the Biden administration frequently acknowledges that. But I think Europeans have to understand what the role that the Biden administration sees for them in that sort of effort to manage China's rise together. Clearly, Asian allies are the central front. Since during the Cold War, Europe was the central front. It's no longer the central front from an American perspective. And so, the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Indians and the Australians play a much more central role in dealing with China than the Europeans do. And that is reflected by the fact that the only two leaders to come to the White House, the only two foreign leaders to come to the White House so far in the Biden presidency have been the Japanese and South Koreans. Europe has a role. I mean, in this effort, obviously, Europe is important for dealing with China, has an important relationship with China. It's critical in struggles over technology and regulations and trade and investment that are part of the sort of larger ideological geoeconomic struggle that the United States sees itself in. And particularly, Europe is a huge repository of democratic values and legitimacy, which is the way that Biden is framing the struggle against China. But the truth is that the Americans don't really expect much out of Europe on China. They don't really think that Europe will ever be able to get its act sufficiently together to be a very important ally vis-a-vis China. And at the same time, they don't think that Europe will ever be a problem really vis-a-vis China, because it doesn't have a good enough relationship with China. It's too democratic. It's too resistant to Chinese influence to ever be, dominated by China. So in that sense, Europe is neither the solution nor the problem to America's China issue. And that means that they're not really paying very much attention to what Europeans think or want. And you can see this in a series of decisions beyond the speeches in the early Biden administration. Just to list a few, the Trump administration tried to undo the travel ban against the EU just as it left office. Biden reversed that. Biden just a week or two ago hung the Europeans out to dry by suddenly reversing his position on intellectual property protections for vaccines, which the Europeans found very unwelcome. The Europeans complained dramatically about not being consulted on a host of decisions, principally the most prominently, I should say, the decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. But that one shows the template from an American perspective, because even as Europeans complained about that, especially in private meetings and things, said we're not consulted enough, they voted for it the next day in the NATO Council unanimously. And this verifies the U.S. approach to Europe, which is that they complain a lot about being consulted, but they never do anything about it. So what's the difference? You'll get the same amount of cooperation out of them whether you consult or not. So, I mean, I think we can talk about it more in about what all this means in the discussion. But I would say that if Europe wants to be part of, if you want to reimagine transatlantic relationships and make it useful to both sides, you have to think, Europeans have to think about how to achieve greater balance in the relationship, and Americans have to think about enabling them to do that. So we can get into more specificity about how to do that in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you for this very enriching and very complete presentation. You have already identified the main issue in order to reimagine the transatlantic relations for the years to come. So the first question that I would like to ask you is about the vaccine diplomacy and the infodemic question. We already talked a little bit about NATO, so I will ask you about NATO after. So regarding the vaccine diplomacy, the COVID-19 has affected transatlantic relations, and the EU has faced critical problems with the companies such as AstraZeneca, which has delayed the supply of vaccine in the continent. On the opposite, the US has won the first vaccine race by providing sufficient vaccines to American citizens. To provide vaccines to less privileged countries, Europeans and Americans have also implemented the COVAX system. However, it is now insufficient to provide and buy vaccines for everyone. It seems nowadays that Russia and China are taking all the credits for supplying vaccines. In that context, President Michel said at the beginning of May to EU leaders that vaccines have become security policy and the EU cannot afford to lag behind. So what about now the transatlantic relation? We have a specific view in Europe about what should be the vaccine diplomacy, about the problem with COVAX, but how should vaccine diplomacy be shaped? Do you think that the transatlantic alliance is the ideal layer to get concrete results, or do you consider that the EU and the US should push to solve this issue at the international level?
Who are you addressing that question
to? To anyone. I think maybe to Mrs. Gergich.
Sure. I'm happy to kind of offer a couple of thoughts on that. I think first, last year we were talking about mass diplomacy, about equipment diplomacy, and this year it became all about vaccine diplomacy. So I think we just kind of keep on changing the objects that we, create these new kind of streams within diplomacy studies. But we have seen, there are some continuities in terms of what you have identified already, the kind of bad Samaritans kind of seemingly taking the credit here, Russia and China namely, but I think here even, just as last year, it was an issue around faulty equipment or masks that weren't quite up to scratch. This year, obviously, we know that there are stories and concerns around the efficacy, say, of Sputnik or Sinovac or Sinopharm. So again, kind of, I think that there is the sort of resonance. Europe, again, seemingly, or European European Union in specific, to just be very, very kind of specific about that, European Union gets way worse rep than it ends up kind of, or the things that it ends up doing in the end, right? And I think, again, if you think about last year and just the sort of issue with obtaining masks and equipment, there was cooperation going on, or even in terms of care for those who are sick, that there was intra-European Union sort of cooperation. What emerged was much more these stories about the kind of hoarding and the nationalism that went on around just equipment again and material, and again similar this year, where European Union has exported quite a chunk of the world's vaccines, but again, it hasn't necessarily put forward a good story about that. What has changed most drastically is obviously the US, where last year it was very much a story of unilateralism, and increasingly we are seeing obviously the United States not just leading the way in terms of vaccination rates at home, but now being able to provide it to the rest of the world. Now, on this question of whether multilateralism via COVAX or transatlanticism is a better way to go, that's, I mean, it depends on where you stand on kind of issues of international cooperation. I think any sort of cooperation that will go towards relief and towards providing help and aid to those that need it most. And we are seeing countries in the developing world, those that are reeling at the moment, from India to Southeast Asia, right, to parts of Latin America that have been really hit hard now in this fourth wave. They just need those vaccines. And what's a matter of fact is that I think the last stats were that around 2 billion people have received vaccines so far, but most of them tend to live in the most developed countries of the world. So there is a huge issue still. I would say that if, this question that arises around whether US or maybe US and EU will use this in terms of potential kind of soft power projection ultimately, even though that's not quite the right term. I don't like that because, again, it's a material help, so it is part of hard power, maybe not the one that we necessarily associate with hard power, but still, I mean, again, ultimately, if you do provide aid, some goodwill will come out of it. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not under any sort of pretense or a kind of naive belief that there won't be some sort of geopol or geostrategic calculation made on that front. But again, my biggest concern is that still there's way too much talk while in terms of action that we are seeing on this front, there's way more to be done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shapiro, Ms. Rizzo, do you have anything to add on this specific question?
I mean, I guess I would just go back to the point that I made in my opening remarks when it comes to the G7 meeting coming up. I think it was on a New Statesman podcast that David Miliband was on, and they were asking him about the G7, and he said that, these organizations, these multilateral fora, sort of risk becoming irrelevant if nothing actually comes out of them. If something comes out of them, that's great. And so I think that we actually have an opportunity here in a week or so, where you have the 7 richest nations in the world to come together and figure out how to ensure things like vaccine nationalism don't happen, how to ensure that developing nations have equal access. And so I think that in terms of, there is a transatlantic element to that, but it also goes far beyond that.
Yeah, I think this almost provides a little bit of a warning. There is, the Transatlantic Alliance is great, useful for many, many things. It's busy on a daily basis, which is also a good thing. It produces things as Rachel wants. It's not great for everything. And I think you have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes every time a problem arises, and Dr. Gergich was getting at this, we say, well, gee, vaccines are important. So how can NATO get in on the vaccine game? Terrorism is important. How can NATO get into the vaccine game? And it seems to me sometimes we're asking, instead of asking, what can NATO or the Transatlantic Alliance do for pandemic relief, we're asking what can pandemic relief do for NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance, which is the wrong way to look at it. I think that this is an extremely important issue, but I don't think it's actually a very important transatlantic issue, which is what Rachel was saying. The G7, or even better, the G20, would be a much better forum for this. I think, one of the reasons it's not a great transatlantic issue is that vaccine nationalism, as much as we might deplore it, is the policy of every country on earth. And there is no power in the Transatlantic Alliance or anywhere else that can change that. And we have to acknowledge that fact. And I think that also means that bringing it into a tight alliance where disputes can be quite damaging is a little bit scary. And we would be better off trying to contain it in the looser forum like the G7 and the G20.
Thank you very much. So we see that there is still some work to do regarding how to solve the pandemic, and that maybe the Transatlantic Alliance is not the real tool, is not the real place in order to find a solution in order to vaccine and to reach a global immunity. I would like now to ask you a question regarding NATO, given also your field of expertise, and because NATO has always been the main pillar of transatlantic relations. However, in the last years, America has called Europe to take responsibility for its defense and security. The EU has reached some limited achievements, for instance, PESCO. Some have argued for a more mature partnership and also an equal burden sharing in security issues and inside NATO. And President Biden has called on rebuilding alliances and strengthening NATO in the context also of the NATO 2030 initiative. So I just would like to ask you, how do you envisage the future of NATO cooperation? How do you think that the alliance should be strengthened? And also, can we see a shift in mentality from a zero-sum game approach to the multilateral approach? I would start maybe with Miss.
Yes,
so you are designated.
I'm going to make a point that I make all the time, and Jeremy's heard this. So I think for a long time, as you mentioned in your question, NATO has been the foundation of the Transatlantic Alliance. When the United States thinks about our relationship with Europe, we often think about it through the lens of NATO. And I mean, obviously NATO is hugely important. But to me, doing so sort of over-militarizes the transatlantic relationship and creates a situation where the primary lens through which we view it is that of security and defense. And then what ends up happening is you have leaders in the United States who push Europe to do more. You have to spend more on defense. You have to become more forward-leaning in your foreign and security policy. And then when Europe makes efforts to do just that, they get a lot of pushback from Washington. So I think of PESCO, for example, when I think it was a few years ago that PESCO really became part of the conversation. There was a lot of pushback from Washington. There were top DoD officials that said they were worried that PESCO was going to become a protectionist vehicle for European defense industry, that it was going to duplicate NATO, that it was going to undermine NATO. And so you see us really pushing hard. And then when NATO or the European Union or European countries take steps to do what we've asked, we say, well, don't do it that way. And well, we don't actually like that. And so it creates a lot of friction. At the same time, during the Trump administration, he was so forceful toward Europeans on spending more on defense that being pro-defense spending in certain European countries, I'm thinking of Germany, I was living there at the time, became sort of a pro-American and pro-Trump viewpoint. And so people actually became more anti-defense spending in Germany, which, touched 22. And so I think the Biden administration has a real opportunity here to stand by what we say when we tell Europe to spend more and do more, and to actually support them when they do that. I don't think that European defense capabilities or building those up will undermine NATO, and I think that there are forums in place and consultative processes in place that would ensure that that doesn't happen. And you know, at the end of the day, a stronger Europe does mean a stronger NATO and a stronger transatlantic alliance. So we should actually support that. So yeah, that's what I think about that.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Georgic.
Yeah, just 2 cents, and I would wholeheartedly agree with this last point that you know, the stronger Europe gets, the better it is ultimately for NATO as well. It's not necessarily the end of it, but I think that we do need to find out what the answer to some of these big questions that loom are going to be vis-a-vis one, the new strategic concept for NATO that's in the works, and that's something to keep an eye on, because obviously NATO keeps on reinventing the reason why it's there every decade or so, right? And these days we are now, you know, in this kind of phase of NATO 2030 planning and the initiative, which sees NATO obviously as recommitting against to defense deterrence, but also becoming more political, more global, seeing that obviously there are plenty of global challenges, that it's not going to necessarily become a global alliance, but that it needs to think about working with those that are outside of the transatlantic space, because those issues that are global really warrant and demand such cooperation. So that's a kind of a new way for NATO to be thinking after, obviously, thinking, you know, in terms of out of area sort of missions, right, which is what core business basically became over the past 2 decades. And sort of, again, going back to that drawing board and having these sort of talks about trade-offs of what this will mean vis-a-vis, you know, just focusing on the transatlantic space and so on. But then the bigger question is one that Rachel has pointed out around European strategic autonomy more broadly, right? And this is, there are some who say that basically Europeans squandered the past 4 years in actually not coming up with anything concrete on this front. And that in any case, because European Union obviously operates as a supranational entity rather than a single state, it will never be able to actually kind of balance against or in any way be a true rival to any a major power, including Russia, and Russia primarily. But I think the bigger question here is also, what is it that we talk about when we talk about defense in Europe? And this is one of the main kind of stumbling blocks, because for some, you know, when French talk about defense and strategic autonomy, for them, this is basically kind of being able to project in Sahel, right? They're not so worried about Russia. But when you talk to any of the 3 Baltic states or Poland, right, then you basically get the sort of, you know, rightful obsession with what's happening just at their doorstep. So in that sense, we will not go I don't think anywhere further in terms of finding that kind of consensus, but certainly some of these questions are becoming even more pressing than they have been. And that's simply because we are seeing, you know, Russia certainly not backing away and not, you know, indicating that that's going to be a change tune anytime soon. And then again, the question of China, but not necessarily through the kind of conventional defense, but certainly, you know, again, warranting the transatlantic cooperation. So yeah, maybe dovetailing somewhat with what Jeremy was saying.
Yes, exactly. So thank you very much for this question. So I will just follow follow up with the question that you identified to ask them to Dr. Shapiro. So, how would you proceed in order to help the European to define their defense autonomy? How can we? What is the meaning of defense in Europe? How would you maybe help the European institutions to implement a European defense autonomy plan?
Oh, geez, it's not that hard, but they have to want it. And I think as Dr. Curtis is saying, it's not clear that they do. There is a sort of ritualistic approach to this question in transatlantic relations. You said that the U.S. has been pushing them to do defense spending in recent years. No, the U.S. has been pushing them to defense spending, greater defense spending since 1952. When I was a U.S. official working on Europe, I would sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night that the Europeans should spend more on defense. It wasn't great for my relationships. And what's weird about this, and I think Rachel was getting at it, is that even though we've been, in theory, Americans want Europeans to spend more on defense and Europeans want more strategic autonomy, I don't think either of them actually wants it. The Americans, as Rachel was pointing out, are basically addicted to leadership and addicted to selling weapons to Europe, which is a key part of U.S. defense industrial base strategy. Europeans don't actually want to spend more on defense. They don't want to reach compromises with their European neighbors about what that defense spending would be for. And they don't believe in the credibility of their neighbors to defend them and prefer the Americans. So there is a sort of tacit conspiracy to undermine the very words that both sides speak, and it's a sort of mutual conspiracy. I think that's a sort of toxic codependency. It's very hard to break that cycle of toxic codependency, but I think it's absolutely necessary, because at the moment, what it means is that Europeans are mad at Americans for being arrogant, and Americans are mad at Europeans for being feckless. They're both right, and they don't have a balanced relationship, a balanced alliance, which will be necessary to confront the mutual problems that confront them. And that, I think, is at the source of why, as I pointed out, America is sort of moving ahead in its China policy without much reference to Europe.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. So, summarize a little bit. So we need to find, the Europeans need to find a common understanding on the concept of defense in order maybe to reach a European defense autonomy. We can also question ourselves regarding the fact if they really want to have defense autonomy, because as you just mentioned, Dr. Shapiro, the Americans are addicted to leadership and to selling weapons to the Europeans. It is a complicated issue also for the Europeans, because they don't have the same, maybe the same understandings and the same willingness to reach European defense community. I have prepared another question regarding the issue of climate, because I see in the chat for the moment only one question that is related to trade. So it will allow us just after the question on climate to also talk a little bit about the US and China relationships. So regarding climate, it is also very important in my perspective to talk about this issue when we think about the future transatlantic relation, because it has been a very pressing issue, such as during the transatlantic conference organized by AmCham EU last March, where the panelists have outlined the necessity to coordinate and to build synergy between economic recovery and positive climate change. So what are the prospects now for a fruitful collaboration on climate change for the transatlantic partnerships? Do you think that the US and the EU can take a global leadership in this matter? And also a sub-question, what will be the influence of private actors, notably in innovation, research and development for clean technologies? So I will direct the question to maybe Dr. Gergic, if you are willing to answer. Or
I've unmuted myself. I am not an environmental scientist, and climate science and climate issues are not necessarily the front kind of focus of my research attention, but certainly it was interesting to see when President Biden convened that climate summit, how everyone started outbidding each other in terms of their commitments to reach carbon neutrality, and how fast and with what sort of means and so on. I think that it's a really welcomed and much needed change, obviously, from the previous administration, rejoining Paris deal, obviously all of those things that have been missing, as well as the whole host of executive orders and action that has taken place, obviously, since January 20th in the United States on that front. Again, as I said in my opening remarks, we are seeing a lot of talk, right? We are seeing the kind of restoration of leadership in rhetoric, but in terms of substance, we will, and we are yet to see what this will mean. Obviously, President Biden has this whole agenda on building back better and tying the environmental issues to infrastructure as well. A lot of these things, obviously, for all of you who are students of American politics, you know that this is something that can't just be done through executive action. Some of these things actually need to pass through the Congress, and we are already seeing that some of these plans on that front are being thwarted by those who are more moderate on the Democratic side, at least in the Senate, and as well as obviously Republicans who are not too keen on cooperating. But certainly, I think the big sort of milestone is the Conference of Parties that will take place in Scotland later this year. I think some of the talks on engaging with EU's carbon border plan would be, border tax plan would be something that would be welcomed, and seeing maybe how some of these issues again can be a platform for US and EU to also think about their trade, and also working together to, and I'm going to go back to, again, Jeremy, on the US and EU versus China, right? And always, or working with EU to work with engaging China on climate issues. So I think that there is plenty of potential for overlap with EU's Green New Deal, but again, or Green Deal, sorry, but again, nothing has emerged concrete, obviously, and it's still very early days. So we can have this conversation maybe in a year and see what has come out from the first year.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gergic, for sharing your view on the climate issue and its impact on the future of transatlantic relations. So we have received some questions from the audience. There are 4 questions that I am going to ask to you, unless Mariam, unless the participants are asked directly the question.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you meant there.
Yeah, I think you asked them.
Yeah,
I asked them. Perfect. So we have a first question. Do you think, asked by Kenna King, do you think the US is justified in asking Europe to spend more money on defense? So I will direct this question to Ms. Rizzo.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, the Trump administration, I think, got a lot of attention for pushing the Europeans really hard to increase their defense spending. But I think it's really important to remember that Trump was not the first president to do this. This has been going on for a very long time. And it's been a constant struggle. And I think that if we want a more equal relationship rather than a senior-junior partnership, and I know Jeremy was talking about this a little bit, that both sides have to want it, the Europeans do need to step up and take more responsibility for their own defense. And that means increasing their defense spending, but that also means increasing the defense spending in the right way when it comes to capabilities. And the willingness to use those capabilities when necessary. And at the same time, the U.S. needs to mean it when we say that we want the Europeans to do so.
So thank you very much for answering this question. I will now move to the second question that was the first asked in the chat, and it will allow us to also tackle the trade issue. That is very important for the understanding the future of transatlantic relations. So the person asks, is the non-ratification of CAA by the European Parliament going to affect the implementation of Phase 1 deal between US-China at all? Should the Biden administration work with the EU on defining a transatlantic trade strategy towards China to push for IP protection and tackle Chinese foreign subsidies? Dr. Shapiro, I see that you are willing to maybe answer
you can see that, huh? Okay.
this question.
Well, I don't know if I go that far, but I will answer it. Well, first of all, the non-ratification of the CAI hasn't happened yet, right? I mean, it can never happen because it's a non-event. It looks very unlikely that the CAI will ratify, but I don't think that has much impact on the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal, which is by and large a moribund anyway, regardless of what happens with CAI. China is not meeting its promises with regard to the Phase 1 deal. Was a stupid deal in the first place. It was a sort of fake deal that the Trump administration rigged up to pretend that they were making progress when they weren't. So that's a lot of. So I wouldn't pay much attention to that particular aspect. But I think that the second part of the question is an absolutely essential and important one, which is this question of what the U.S. should be seeking to do with the EU in terms of defining a trade strategy. I think it would be great if they could do that. I don't think that they think they can, and so I don't think that they're going to try. It's just too much effort that's unlikely to lead to much. I do think you see various sort of efforts beneath the level of a grand trade strategy to try to attack some of the particular issues that the questioner, Mr. Anonymous attendee, gets at, which is this. So there's various efforts in various multilateral organizations to deal with IP protection. All of those are sort of critical issues in the Biden administration's China management strategy. Europe plays a part in all of them, some greater than others. But I don't think you're going to see an effort to sort of construct a grand united front. To the extent that there will be a grand united front against China in the trade realm, I think you'll see that coming in the Asia Pacific around the CPTPP, which I think the United States is going to be anxious to have some sort of relationship with moving forward. The UK has already applied to join that. I think the EU maybe also get interested in that. And I think that that's the locus around which that will likely form. One sort of subpoint is that the U.S. and the EU have already started a tech alliance. They've started talks on a tech alliance just in the last couple of weeks, which is looking at trying to deal with some of the Chinese foreign subsidy issues that get brought up. And so there's definitely a European component to that.
Thank you very much for answering this question. Maybe Dr. Georgic, you have anything to add on this specific issue of trade and the future of the U.S. and China relationships?
No, I wouldn't add anything to this. I was just looking through the questions and I saw one on Western.
Yeah, exactly.
So hello to whoever hails from that region or is interested in that region. But I also see that it's 5:15, so I don't know.
No, but we have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes. So it was the question that I wanted to ask you now. So perfect. So
right.
the question is, what will EU-US cooperation look like going forward in the Western Balkans?
Yeah. So. I have a kind of 100,000 words kind of manuscript, and also like maybe 100 words period, so that you all don't sign out immediately. But yeah, this is.
Let's hear the 100-word version.
I thought so. Even though I'm sure that you were torn, right? Like, I'm
gonna wait for the movie on the book.
Absolutely. So yeah, work in progress, the consequences of success, as it's tentatively titled. Look, so I think that the region has been really looking forward to seeing Joe Biden in the White House, because he's a really known entity from his time as a senator, actually, from being one of the crucial figures in the 90s in advocating a more assertive and kind of more productive response to what was going on in the context of Yugoslav wars of dissolution. But the thing here these days, the kind of main issue is, while the United States might offer that sort of important kind of role in signaling to the parties that there is still commitment to Dayton Agreement, to the borders as they are, to maintaining, say, the absence of conflict. The ball is really in EU's court, because the US, as we've heard a number of times, doesn't have the strategic attention or the bandwidth to be involved in any sort of, or to the extent to which the region would like it, even though it's a kind of messy story where, regional leaders tend to say, we need to kind of graduate above this, but at the same time, whenever there is a stumbling block, it's always the US that gets called upon to adjudicate, because the region has been very suspicious towards European powers, simply because of the way things kind of unraveled in the early 90s. But the main problem, as I see it here in terms of the US-EU cooperation, is that EU can't credibly commit to enlarge and to absorb the 6 remaining Western Balkan countries anytime soon, right? So this kind of the dangling of the EU membership, it's clear pretty much to everyone, is not something that's going to happen anytime in the near term, medium term, for sure. And this is what's actually stopping a lot of the potential democratic progress in a lot of the places. Mind you, we have seen some very welcome changes, like in Kosovo or in North Macedonia, but at the same time, when you don't have that perspective, it's very hard to see where, the kind of the push for further kind of democratization is going to come from. And this is something that's being exploited by outside powers like Russia, like China, increasingly, and some others. So I'm not super optimistic about what's going to happen, but I think it's a welcome change, at least in terms of the US is now not doing harm, which is actually what we've seen in the last 2 years of Trump administration, with that whole agreement that Grenell dreamed up, and then the giving of the pens and keys to the White House photo ops with Vučić in White House and so on. So at least on that front, we are seeing some sort of return. But I think this is very much an issue that is in EU's court, and it will be up to EU to resolve it.
So thank you very much for the compacted 1,000,
a bit more than
100,000 words, sorry, in 6 minutes. Dr. Shapiro and Mrs. Rizzo, do you have any further comments to add on the future of the EU and Balkan relations?
Not a lot. I thought that was a very perspicacious answer, actually, and I rarely hear that from European. I think that the damage that was done during the Trump administration to Balkan policy was indicative of the problems that you can get into if the U.S. gets too involved in this issue. Because what happens is that the parties on the ground start to arbitrage between the U.S. and the EU, and they start to basically go around shopping for the best deal that they can get. And that's the trap that the Trump administration fell into. The Europeans have fallen into that trap occasionally as well. And I do think that it's really important that both sides recognize the key to Balkan policy to let the EU lead and for the Americans to basically do whatever the EU tells them to do, which is very hard for both sides to pull off. I think that the second point, which Dr. Gergich also sort of alluded to, but I wanted to emphasize it, is that the accession process is not the path anymore, for better or for worse, toward settling Balkan differences. It used to be a great carrot to hold out. It doesn't work anymore. And we all know why. I think it's because the Slovenians threw the door shut after they came in, something like that. But I don't know. Could be something else. Yeah. No, just for the record, I was just kidding. I was making fun. But it's not working. And I do think that the Europeans urgently need to think about a non-accession path, which is something that they've been toward Balkan negotiation, which is, I think, something that they've been reluctant to do, and the region really doesn't want them to do. But I think it's absolutely necessary in order to sort of address some of the issues outside of the accession process. So
thank you very much for proposing such interesting solution. So we are coming to an end of this panel. So I would like to thank you very much. We have talked about climate, we have talked about NATO, defense, security, vaccine diplomacy, and I think that the participants have now more knowledge. They have maybe deepened their understandings on several very important topics in order to reimagine and the transatlantic relations. I hope it will enrich their policy papers that they will present, I think, during the weekend. So I would like to thank you very much and for answering to all my to all the questions and to all the questions of the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the attendees for staying with us. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we have come to the end of our session. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
A good weekend. Bye.
Thank you as well.